Now, in the previous session, we heard from experts on Asia's strategic landscape and the foreign policy trajectories of the key players. And in this session, we're going to try and focus on the economy and business. Now, it's clear that the strategic landscape, especially the US-China dynamic, is having a significant impact on the economies in the region. One that will likely play out over decades to come. So, echoing what Danny said this morning, this is not something that is with us for a year or two. It's with us for decades and decades. Not only is it going to take a long time to play out, it's going to alter the context and the environment in which governments, businesses and citizens take decisions. So this is not only a tectonic geopolitical shift, we're also seeing a seismic shift in the role of governments and business. Now, many of us in this room have spent decades of our careers trying to build a market environment in our region that was less reliant on governments allocating resources. There is no small irony, therefore, and indeed more than a hint of regret, that we now find ourselves spending so much time talking about and anticipating the next move by governments of either of the major powers. So today I want to focus on three aspects of regional economics, three dimensions that are going to be important for us. First, great power competition. Second, technology. And then third, how can Australia take advantage of the opportunities that our region offers us? Last year, the former US Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson warned of the economic iron curtain that was descending that could divide the world if the US and China failed to manage their strategic differences. Since that speech, you'd have to say that the curtain has descended further than where it was when Hank raised that issue. Great power competition, such as that between the United States and China, can easily disrupt regional growth. Our region's economies are deeply interlinked. Most of the tradable goods produced in the region require inputs from other countries. Often the same goods move across borders in the region many times and at very thin margins before they finally reach the ultimate end consumer. The business and trading model fundamentally depends on these countries having a stable policy environment and being open to each other. So where are we now? Well, great uncertainty exists over long supply lines. The export-led growth model in East Asia that underpinned economic development of many of Australia's key trading partners is dependent on those long supply lines. Only 9 years ago, China was experiencing double-digit growth in GDP. This year, it fell to 6.2%. And it will, not it is likely, but it will continue to fall over time as the Chinese economy matures. It is impossible for countries as they move closer and closer to the frontier to grow faster than the 3 Ps will allow it to. There's population, participation, productivity. The point, though, is not that China's growth rate has slowed. The real point that's being missed, I think, is that the growth model which lifted the Asian tigers and then China is no longer a viable development path for countries that are following behind. That export-led growth model promised prosperity if countries opened themselves up to the world, importing not only the best technologies, but everything that markets require to work. So if we lose that openness, if we lose that confidence in the stability, regulatory and policy stability of various parts of the regional supply chain, then it's impossible for long supply chains to exist in the region, and therefore it makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for countries to follow the same sort of growth path that we've seen the Asian tigers and now China pursue. Now, Australia and the region has much to lose from a concerted effort to decouple the US and Chinese economies, possibly even more than the damage that would be done to each of the two superpowers themselves. So what would be necessary conditions for what Paulson has called a long winter? And I'm emphasising these are necessary but not possibly sufficient conditions to avoid it. So the first of these is that China would need to continue the reforms it started in the 1970s, paying particular attention to the areas where the United States has legitimate concerns. Ironically, and despite the rhetoric and mistaken beliefs of some particularly vitriolic China critics, this will actually make China stronger, not weaker. Redirecting resources from unproductive state-owned enterprises will relieve a burden on the thriving private sector. Allowing more market forces into the finance sector will stop the suppression of Chinese savers and provide new channels for their capital to flow overseas. Indeed, now more than ever, continued reform of the Chinese economy provides the best path for sustainable prosperity throughout the region. The second necessary condition, though, is that we need to improve rather than discard international trade rules. The G20 has acknowledged the need for WTO reform. As the Prime Minister said on this very platform only recently, the rules-based order is in need of urgent repair, and this should be a priority for countries like ours that understand the fundamental importance of a trading system that supports right, not might. Bilateral deals that simply divert trade impose unnecessary costs, reduce global growth, and add even more uncertainty into the international trading environment, effectively emulating the kinds of state-backed direction that liberal market economies should be condemning. The answer to unacceptable trade practices is more effective rules, not no rules. So these two preconditions could reduce trade tensions, but they cannot remove geopolitical competition in our region, a competition that is going to define the region over the coming generation. Even if the US and China drop all recently imposed tariffs, confidence in the economic rules-based order has already been damaged. Now, I'm just talking about the economic rules-based order, but I think that actually applies to the rules-based order writ large. The collapse of confidence in the international system undermines the long-term confidence that underpins foreign direct investment. Indeed, we're already seeing companies moving production and changing suppliers and indeed changing customers in response to the tension between the two great powers. My view is that this degree of sovereign imposed risk on markets will continue for many years, perhaps decades, unless there's some new and sustainable accommodation able to be worked out between China and the United States. Now, while great power competition poses significant challenges for our region, rapid technological change poses others. But quite a different challenge, especially one for low-income workers. Export-led growth, as I said, has been the main path to development for emerging economies in this region, and manufacturing has been the backbone of that growth model. However, new technology may be reducing the development benefits available to countries from manufacturing. Countries are reaching peak industrialisation at levels lower than they were in the past. For example, the manufacturing share of employment is already declining in many developing countries. Regional unskilled workers used to transition from agriculture to manufacturing, but now this gateway is increasingly being filled by advanced machinery. A key global trend that we should keep our eye on, therefore, is how fast manufacturing is improving productivity relative to the services sector. Nowadays, you simply do not need as much capital to deliver the same output in manufacturing as we've been historically used to. This is presumably one of the many reasons why global interest rates are so low. Investment is historically low because businesses can get more out of their capital than they've done in the past. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's simple. It means the economies, more and more of the economies in the region will begin to look like Australia earlier in their development strategies. That is, they'll find that they have services being an increasing share of their economies. And if you don't believe me, think about India. India is a classic case. It doesn't have a significant manufacturing sector of the sort that we've seen in China, but it's got a massive services sector. Now, one of the things that comes with that is that it's very difficult to impose tariffs on services. So you'd think, okay, that's good for a free and open trading system. The problem is the shift to services economy makes it actually easier to slip into protectionism, not harder, because it's behind the border barriers that are much harder to follow. They can take all sorts of guises, they're easier to disguise, and there are much fewer international rules to constrain countries in their imposition and application. Now, technology may even be one reason why Western countries are finding it difficult to lift inflation. Many of us have seen a flattening of the Phillips curve, that is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation, and a shift to a lower level of unemployment consistent with stable inflation. And I think that's at least in part due to technology making the supply side of the economy more responsive. In other words, what I was saying, you get more output per unit of capital, and hence there's less investment. The flip side of that is you're actually expanding the supply side of the economy more rapidly, making it more flexible, and hence you can lower unemployment without triggering the traditional inflationary pressures. And if you don't believe me, just take one example. In the past, we used to think about, if we were relatively straightforward in our thinking, we used to think about the number of unemployed as the pool of reserve labour that we could call on if job growth started to become quite rapid. Then we started to think about, well, no, it's also underemployment because people move from being partly be employed part-time to wanting to be employed full-time. In fact, now what we've got is a system where we've got a whole series of contingent workers who are sitting out there, not actually in the labour force, but who are immediately able to come and work as soon as the app bings and tells them there's work available. So that's changing the nature of the way in which the labour market's operating. And you can see that there are counterparts to that showing up in the way companies in the region are embracing new technology, whether it's Gojek in Indonesia or Alipay in China. And indeed, one of the things that's sort of quite striking is that emerging economies are leapfrogging stages of particularly financial development that we in the West had to work our way through. So if you want an example again, think about going from cash immediately to mobile payments without wading through checks and credit cards as we've done. And indeed, in China, scanning a QR code is pretty much the norm now if you want to make a payment. And you'd actually stand out pulling cash or a credit card out of your wallet. So technologies deliver benefits, and some of them genuinely transform our societies, but they also raise really important policy questions which we're going to have to grapple with if we want to think about how we capture the dynamism and sustain the dynamism of our region. Large firms like Facebook, Google and Amazon face intense scrutiny from the public, legislators and regulators. And these large online platforms are posing new economic problems for us, such as, I'll give you a few examples. Should the rules governing trade in data be the same across countries? We don't have any rules around the trade in data. We're starting to develop rules about the trade in data within countries, but there are none across countries. Is there a trade-off between personal data protection and investing in big data and AI? Does the sheer scale of large networks provide inappropriate competitive advantages? How should we think about competition in respect of two-sided platforms that charge other businesses to list but provide the services free to consumers? How should governments respond to platforms that are larger and more influential than many states are? And finally, how do we best tax and regulate platforms that are often based in other countries? Now, if you think about it, all of those require internationally agreed rules. And so that's an area where you'd like to see the rules-based international order organically growing and developing. But as we discussed this morning, the rules-based international order is under pressure, whether it's in the broader international relations sphere or, as I've alluded to, in the economic sphere. Now, step back and think about this from the vantage point of history, and much of the post-war order that we are seeing now being contested was created by the United States out of a desire to never again see the tragedies like the Great Depression and the Second World War. Perhaps because this experiment was so successful, some have forgotten the reasons for the existence of the order in the first place, and I could see Danny's grinning. If there's one lesson from history, above all, it's that things can easily spiral downwards, curtains can close, and the world can become a very not nice place indeed. And I would go on and say that a recent book by Hal Brands and Charles Edel called The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order should be compulsory reading for people. Because what Brands and Edel point out is that if we don't have a keen sense for the potential for tragedy, then we've got nothing to motivate us to avoid it. Now, the post-war period was unique in that it constrained, as Danny said earlier, it constrained the exercise of power by countries in the region. Now, it did so because that order was underpinned by US military supremacy. And that's not a criticism. That US military supremacy is actually what contributed to stability in the Asia-Pacific region, Vietnam and Korea aside. But what it did do is it allowed the countries in the region to focus on a prosperity agenda and to indulge our preoccupation with building rules that collectively could make us rich. Intensifying great power rivalry, or at least a rivalry unconstrained by rules, poses a risk to that prosperity. Now, in a region such as ours that has weathered significant storms in the past, such as the Asian financial crisis and the recent Great Recession, what we've seen is that they have shaken support globally and regionally for the Western liberal order. They've played no small part in the declining regional ardour for liberal market institutions and even political reform. Now, both crises helped foster demands for regional specific institutions. Some of them were aborted, such as the Asian Monetary Fund. Some are now in place, such as the Chiang Mai Initiative, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and so on. Now, we should expect, and indeed I'd go further and say we should even welcome this kind of institutional smorgasbord if it means that countries in our region are collectively stepping forward to provide leadership and to build collective resilience. I know that, if you sit in the Bretton Woods institutions, you can have a tendency to look at these sorts of things as competition for you. I actually think that's the wrong way to think about it, if they're being motivated for the right reason. So let me come to the third issue that I wanted to touch on, which is how does Australia cope going forward? Well, I think we're well placed to help collectively manage the challenges that the region will face and to be able to exploit the opportunities. Our region is likely to remain fast-growing and dynamic, even if global growth is subdued. More importantly, the Indo-Pacific is going to continue to supply around 3/4 of annual world growth. That is the increase in global GDP per year. Around 3/4 of it will come from our region. Our friends Indonesia and India are two of the fastest growing economies globally. They're both here. Others, like Vietnam, have huge prospects. Japan's going to remain a large, wealthy economy, and China will continue to grow and deliver obvious improvements in standard of living for its people. The economic success of China is surely the single greatest thing to happen globally over the last 3 decades, and it is to be welcomed, not resented. Now, in our case, we're in our 28th year of uninterrupted economic growth, the longest ever recorded amongst developed economies. We operate with secure, open and non-discriminatory rules underpinning our markets, whether that's for trade in goods, services or for foreign investment. By being open and non-discriminatory, businesses are more willing to invest in trade with Australia because they know their capital's safe, they know that they can get it out, and they know that they won't encounter arbitrary and inconsistent rule enforcement. We're a safe place to send kids to study as much as we are to invest in the future. Perhaps even more important than what we do is how we do it. As I've said before, a key success over the last 3 decades has been our national policy discussions on how best to go forward as a nation. No country can guarantee the rules will never change. What foreigners are betting on when they invest in a country is effectively they're betting on that nation's national character. And I think one of the great things Australia's got going for it is a consistency of national character. We demonstrate our willingness to work closely with partners in our region to reinforce market-based systems, and we heard a lot about the TPP this morning, but it's not only the TPP, it's the work that we do with ASEAN, it's the work we do bilaterally, it's the work we do with New Zealand in the Pacific through PACER, and the work that's underway to try and land the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Our trade deals expand opportunities rather than diverting them. They reinforce the rules rather than abrogating them, and indeed we've entered into free trade agreements with 11 countries or groups of countries, the TPP, ASEAN and RCEP, as I've just mentioned. Now, as the global rules come under pressure, such agreements, such regional agreements, are going to become even more important. Australia, as a middle-sized power, will have less influence than the large economies, but we are clear that we know an open economy works for the good of all, that is for Australia and for its partners. And we can use our knowledge and our national character to help drive reform and change in our region that reinforces those elements, not undermines them. So to let me just sum up, we do face significant challenges as a region. In particular, competition between the great powers, the US and China, is intensifying and is going to be with us for decades to come, and that is going to shape the environment in which our citizens, our governments and our businesses have to take decisions. At the same time, technology is transforming the regional dynamics, creating immense benefits and opportunities, but also raising significant questions. Together, that technological change and that strategic competition and the undermining of the rules-based international order and the potential undermining of the global trading system are going to create challenges for countries that are seeking development pathways. But for Australia, while they're creating challenges, they're also creating fantastic opportunities that we need to go and grasp. So despite the challenging outlook, I'm actually pretty optimistic about the future. I am unusual. I am an optimistic economist. That is not a tautology. It is actually a uniqueness. I'm optimistic about the region. I think we live in a fantastic region. I think we've got great opportunities. We've got challenges. We've got to find a way to manage them. But together, the players in the region can do that, even if individually any single one of us can't manage it by ourselves. I'm optimistic about the region, I'm optimistic about Australia's economic prospects, and I'm particularly optimistic about the role that Australia will attempt to play to help shape and sustain the global rules. Thank you very much.